Hi, we're going to read the story The Experiment together today. It's in the Level A textbook, starts around page 12, 13. But before we read, we need to get prepared. And one of the best ways to get prepared is to think about what you're going to read, just by thinking about the title, but also thinking about why is this story here in the first place. So we have our essential question for this unit. What influences how you act? Everybody behaves differently, but there are so many things that make us who we are, and the person that we are acts in a certain way. What are those things that make us act in a certain way? Sometimes it's the way you're brought up, the things that you think are important, but it's also things outside. There are influences outside of just you. And it could be something like the weather. The weather could influence how you act. So all these different things make different situations. So you need to be flexible and think about it. Now, best way to prepare for reading a new story is to be sure you have reviewed the vocabulary. Throughout the story, the key vocabulary is highlighted in yellow, but remember that at the bottom of your page, they also give you some explanations of other words that they think, might need a little bit more information for you. Now, one thing all short stories have: a plot and a setting. Plot is the things that happen in a story, and the setting is the time and the place when it happens. And don't think of time just like, oh, what time is it? No. Is this a modern story? Is this a story that happened 100, 1,000 years ago? Is it a story that's set in the future? So that's your setting, time and place. Where is it happening? In a city? In a village? In your mind? All of these things. And as I said, plot are the things that happen in a story. So when you're reading the story, pay attention to details. Thinking about, like this paragraph here is talking about the setting. And I'm sorry, my glasses aren't working that well right now. I just got new ones. So there was no way out. The walls of his cell were built of thick cement blocks. A lot of details there. And again, visualize. As you're taking these words, make images, make pictures in your mind to kind of make this little movie of the story that you're reading. The huge doors were made of steel. The floor and ceiling were made of concrete, cement, concrete, all these building materials that are so solid and strong. So these give you details, and then when you're visualizing this, you're also thinking of what you already know about something in order to understand better what is happening in a story. So you use your own experience to do this. So in using your own experience, it's a good idea to preview and predict. And that kind of comes naturally because as you're reading it in your mind, you think, oh, I bet he's going to, and you kind of think of what the character in the story will do next. Sometimes it's exactly what you thought, and sometimes it's a surprise. So make some predictions about the story just by looking at the title. They might give you a picture about the story and pictures throughout the story to help you. And predict. It helps you understand the story better. Now, it's interesting that the author, in writing The Experiment, says, "The day I saw Harry Houdini escape." Harry Houdini was a famous magician, but instead of just, magic tricks, here, pick out a card, I'll tell you what the card is, he did performance magic. So he would be locked in something and somehow he would escape. And these were things that influenced the author into writing his story here. The Experiment by Martin Reim. There was no way out. The walls of his cell were built of thick cement blocks. The huge door was made of steel, and the floor and ceiling were made of concrete, and there were no windows. The only light came from a light bulb that was covered by a metal shield. There was no way out, or so it seemed to him. He had volunteered to be part of a scientific experiment and had been put in the cell to test the cleverness of the human mind. The cell was empty, and he was not allowed to take anything into it. But he had been told that there was one way to escape from the cell, and he had 3 hours to find it. Now, as you're reading, there are little questions here for you to stop and think about. So, the 3-hour time period is part of the setting. How does it affect the plot? So right now, this is going to end in 3 hours, or you think it will. So you've got a set time period. So like he is in a cell, your story is in a cell. You've just got these 3 hours that the story will take place in. It's not a year in the life of somebody, it's just 3 hours. He began with the door. Makes sense, good place to start if you're going to get out. It stood before him, huge and gray. The 3 large hinges on the door were riveted into the wall and could not be removed. You know what? And I'm going to stop just briefly right here. I'm going to show you what a hinge is. Okay. So, here we go. So here's my door. See my door? And this here is the hinge. The hinge is what lets the door open. So they were riveted. It was punched in and held solidly. They were riveted into the wall and could not be removed. The door itself seemed too big for the small cell, and for a minute he wondered if it had been put up first and the rest of the cell built around it. So again, thinking about these things, what is the setting of this work of art? How does it relate to the story? And you've got your words at the bottom to think about. So this picture is kind of like the story. He's talking about the light and the other things. Finally, he turned away from the door and looked around. He tried pushing against the cement blocks to see if any of them were loose. He searched the floor for a trapdoor, something that he could open and get out through. Then he glanced up at the ceiling. The shield around the light bulb. His mind raced, so he was thinking really quickly. The metal shield could be used as a tool, the tool he needed. He had found the way to escape. So, what do you think will happen next? Time to stop and predict. Is it possible to use that metal shield to get out? Okay, record some predictions on your chart. So I didn't ask you to make a chart, but you could write this down to keep track of it, or just think about it. So every time you see one of these things when you're reading, come over to the comprehension question. So read on. I'm so sorry. Read on to see how logical your prediction is. He moved under the shield and looked closely at it. One good strong pull would free it, he decided. He reached up, grabbed hold of it, and pulled. But the shield stayed attached to the ceiling. He grabbed the shield again, twisting it as he pulled. He felt it rip free, and he fell to the floor, clutching his treasure. He was holding it close to himself. The shield was shaped like a cone, so it's kind of a triangle, and had been fastened to the ceiling by 3 long metal prongs. So 3 holding it around the cone. The prongs were sharp, but they were not strong enough to cut through steel or concrete or cement. He felt a hopelessness creep over him. He could find no use for the shield as a tool. The shield was not what he needed to get out. Then he had a brilliant idea. True, the metal prongs of the shield could not cut through the steel door or the concrete floor or the cement blocks in the wall. But the prongs might be strong enough to dig out the mortar that held the cement bricks in place. So when you put bricks together, you have to put this mixture, this wet mixture in between to hold them together, otherwise they might slip. So what you put in between, it's a mortar. You'll see kind of a mortar in your shower if you've got some tiles there. So he was going to dig out the mortar. He pulled off one of the prongs and scraped hard at the mortar. The mortar crumbled into powder. His idea worked. If he removed enough mortar, he could loosen a couple of the cement blocks and then push them out and escape. So, he has a plan. Will it work? Keep in mind, 3 hours. He selected 2 blocks near the door and set to work. The prong dug into the mortar and sent it flying out in a steady stream. The prong was just what he needed. Now he was sure he could escape. He would escape. But his hand made a sudden careless twist, and the metal prong broke into 2 useless pieces. At first, a wave of anger stunned him. Has something ever happened to you and you just instantly got mad? That's like a wave, water washing over you, just this, so mad. At first, a wave of anger stunned him. Then he remembered the shield had 2 more prongs. He pulled off another prong and went back to work. He decided he must be more careful. Nothing must go wrong. There was still plenty of time left. Soon he had chipped out 4 inches of mortar. So now we've got this question, vocabulary. What do you think chipped out means based on the text around it? So if you're understanding what mortar is, you've got your 2 bricks, you've got the mortar chipped out. What is he trying to do? He's trying to remove it. So chipped out, piece of it out. But the jagged edges of the cement blocks had torn the skin off of his knuckles. His hands were bleeding from a dozen burning cuts. His back and shoulders hurt him from the strain of working in one position. I'm older, so I know if I stay, if I sit down for a really long time getting up, I'm kind of stiff and it's hard to move. So when you're maybe kneeling and working away at something, if you don't move out of that position, it hurts. His back and shoulders hurt from the strain of working in one position. The mortar dust blew into his eyes and down his throat. The work dragged on, slower and slower. Suddenly, the second prong broke. For a minute, he welcomed the excuse to stop working. But the thought of failure sent him back into action. We don't like losing. We don't like it at all. We want to do our best all the time. So the thought of failure put him back into action. He pulled off the third and last prong and went to work again. He was a man who did not like to lose. He had to win. The work dragged on and on. He became numb to the pain in his hands. He couldn't feel it anymore. He became numb to the pain in his hands, to the ache in his shoulders. His fingers moved blindly, and his attack against the mortar grew weaker and weaker. It's kind of an interesting thing to say, fingers moving blindly, because blind means you can't see. So what does it mean that your fingers are moving in a way that doesn't see? Think about that one a bit. At last he broke through. He had dug out enough mortar so that now he could see light between the cement blocks. So, time to predict. What do you think will happen next? Why do you think this will happen? So that's an important thing. When you predict, I think this is going to happen, you need to be able to come back in the story and say why you think this is going to happen. If I said, I think he can see light between the cement blocks, so he's going to stop working and have an ice cream cone. That doesn't make any sense. Where does he have ice cream in there? So you have to have a reason, something that makes sense when you're predicting, and you need to come back to the story and be able to say, well, I think this because here it said, and use that information. With a spurt of new energy, he chipped away at the rest of the mortar. Of course there was a way out. He had found it, hadn't he? He had proved that a clever mind could solve any problem. That's how he had done it, with his own cleverness. At that instant, the third prong snapped in his hand. He stared at the useless pieces. Then, in a blind rage, he slammed his fist against the wall. Well, that's not going to help anything. Now, before we move on, here's a picture. Another picture for the story. How does this picture make you feel? Is that a ladder you would want to climb? So, how do you think this person in this painting feels? What in the painting makes you think that? So, use your details and reason and your own experience. For example, me, I do not like climbing ladders. I don't like climbing up 10 feet. 10 feet would take you about to here. that to me looks like an impossible task. So, in my experience, I would say this person's feeling scared. But maybe you have a different idea. You like ladders. Maybe you're thinking, finally, this person's found a way out and they can do it. Oh, but look a little bit more closely at the painting. How do you climb a ladder? Here are the rungs. Oh, I think I'd have a blind rage if I got to this point and realized I couldn't do any more. How can he escape now? 3 prongs, they're all broken. Time is going to be running out. His body hurts. What can he do? Do you have an idea? Behind him, the door of the cell opened slowly. His time had run out. His part of the experiment was over. He was not allowed to talk about the experiment or about his plan of escape. However, he was sure that he could have escaped. He was convinced that he almost had. Actually, he had not even come close. The shield had been put around the light bulb only as a shade for the light. The metal prongs were not meant to be used as a tool. The man had been clever, but he had let his cleverness sidetrack him. If he had not been so quick to use the shield as a tool, if he had not spent all his time chipping out the mortar, and if he had not stopped searching the cell, he might have found the real way out. He might have discovered that he could have left the cell as easily as he had entered. For the huge door had never been locked. So, what do you assume? What did you assume or suppose about the setting based on the text? Why did you make that assumption? So it's the experiment. You're given 3 hours. You know, to me, the fact that you're given 3 hours makes me think it's going to take 3 hours to get out. So you think it's going to be hard. But it was as easy as getting in there. So now when you know the end and you go back and look, you can answer some of these questions when you're reading it. What I'd like you to do now is just look at the PDF of the story, listen to the other narrator read it, and read along with them to help practice your pronunciation and your understanding of the story.